Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today, no matter what it is you're doing. For our free wire tutorial here on YouTube today, I'd like to share with you my layered spiral drop pendant. Let's head down to the board and take a look, and then deep dive into the materials we'll need for this project. So here is our layered spiral drop pendant. Lots of lovely movement. It's jointed up at the top and you've got several layers and areas of interest. Obviously, if you wanted to, you can make that a little bit simpler by just going straight for a bail at the top of the spiral without this extra section, and you could forego those extra sparkly beads around the outside if you wanted to. We are going to be working with a very heavy wire today. This is 1.6mm, equivalent approximately to 14 gauge wire, and I'm using a 12-inch length in raw copper. Now this is quite a beefy wire, and 12 inches should be enough for the whole project, including that upper section. However, if you wanted a larger spiral, you may need just a little bit more. I'm also going to be using some 1mm or 18 gauge wire. I've got some shown in silver colour here. I'll be adding some in antique bronze in a little while. I'm also going to be using some 6mm beads, some 3mm beads, and some fine 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire, shown here in silver. I do love to mix those metals, but you can use whichever colours you desire. So to begin with, I have around about a 12-inch length of that 1.6mm 14 gauge wire, and we're going to start by creating our focal spiral, and you'll see that it's just slightly smaller than the bar with those 6mm beads. However, as mentioned, you can obviously adapt the sizes as you desire. So we're going to start by using our round nose pliers at the very end of that wire. It will definitely do well if you add a little bit of heat and warmth to that wire to make it slightly more fluid. It is a very beefy wire to be working with. So let's begin by rotating those pliers around, and you may need to just go slightly further down the pliers to get going. Once you've got the best part of a circular form, you can begin to use your flat facing pliers. Now I generally prefer to have a sealed little circular form in the middle before I begin to spiral away. It doesn't need to be completely closed up. I just don't particularly want it to catch on clothes and skin and hair. So let's rotate that around in an open spiral, and this is something that you'll definitely get better at with more practice if you are newer to wire wrapping and wire working. But I'm just going to take that round a couple of times. Now you'll notice that in my demonstration piece just here, it's very quickly opening up, somewhat like an ammonite. What I tend to do is to take the wire around to begin with, and then I'll open it up as I see the need. So I might think that that's just about enough, and we'll see what that looks like if we open it up a little bit. I might just go a little bit further around. There we go, that looks decent to me. So usually I will have the cut end either at the very bottom or at the very top of that central section, but you can do exactly as you please. So once we've decided that that's around about the right number of turns of wire, we're going to start opening it out a bit. If you prefer, you can directly create that more open spiral. Now because we worked with a little bit of warmth in that wire, you should be able to tease that open by hand. However, do use your pliers should you need to. This can result in tool marking, so it's up to you, depends on how much you feel that that's going to be an issue for you. If you don't like the idea, then do consider using some nylon jaw pliers, or just use your fingers to prise the wire open. Now when I'm working with raw copper, I do tend to get quite black hands, so if you see some black on my fingers, it's not because I've not washed my hands, it's because copper does that when I handle it. So I'm just going to open that out a little bit so that my spiral is the right kind of what I've got in my mind's eye. You can even kind of go a little bit further if you need to. I think in terms of size and how that's coming away, that looks pretty decent to me. So I'm going to create an upright bend up at the top of my spiral. You could go a few more turns if you wanted to, if you wanted it to be a little bit more spirally and dramatic. So once I've finished my spiraling shape, I'm just going to draw that wire up and away, at a nice straight line up at the top. And it really is important that when you have made that angle change, and it can be a little bit sharper if you need it to be, by pushing the spiral further along and then drawing it back. But what we do want to happen is for the upright section to travel directly through the very centre of that spiral form. So you might need to just mess around with that to make sure that you're completely happy with how that sits. Once we've found our ideal spiral, we're going to create a small wrapped loop up at the top. So you do need to have a little bit of space between the angle change and where you bring that sideways in a second to create that loop. Now I'm just going to hold that for a moment from underneath because I want my pendant to be jointed and to have loads of movement. I've used a second section to add to the bail. If you want to make this directly into the bail, you'll need to bring the wire forwards and away to create your round form. However, I'm going to make mine exactly as per my demonstration piece, which is utilising a sideways bend. And then I'm going to make a small loop which will fit onto my extender bar in a little while. So let's grab those bail making pliers. I think probably number 2 on my bail makers. And just draw that wire around. And now it is quite a heavy wire, so you might need to wrangle this to get it to do what you want it to, but it's very, very much worth it. So it's kind of tricky with the camera so close, so let's just turn that around and bring the wire over the top. That's a reasonable facsimile of what I actually want it to look like. You can take more time, and obviously you've got a little bit more flexibility with regards to how you can move that around more freely. So what I'm going to do is continue to wind the tail of wire all the way down that neck section to just above where it turns away to become the spiral. It doesn't need to go all the way down, but you do need to get a reasonable number of spirals in position. Now this does take a little bit of work. You can definitely help yourself out by making sure that that wire is nice and warm and fluid. I think I'm going to go for one more. And again, you won't have the camera overhead, so you won't have to worry about holding it in a specific way. Now you might notice that that little section of coils is a little bit baggy, so I will most definitely tidy that up. And what I want to do is to decide which way I want my spiral to rotate. I actually really like it when they are moving in a clockwise fashion, so I'm going to elect that this is the front, which means that I need to take that wire across the back, tighten up that coil so that it looks nice and neat and tidy, and you can do that by popping one side of the pliers at the top, one side at the bottom, and compressing that little spring. Try not to compress your fingertips because that is really very painful when that happens. So my loop at the top is slightly off to one side, so I'll just sort that out. Not that we'll be able to see overly much of it in a minute, but just tidy that up, make sure you're happy. And then I'm going to trim the wire just over the top there. And then I'll take a moment to just tuck this end away. Now that is quite tough with the 14 gauge or 1.6mm gauge wire, so you may need to employ a second set of pliers to hold that sideways loop up at the top. So do take your time and make sure that you're happy with how that looks, and reserve the remainder of your wire to make the jointed bail up at the top later. If you find that the 1.6mm or 14 gauge wire is a little bit extreme for you, do try instead with the 1.25mm 16 gauge, and then maybe just hammer the spiral to give it some extra strength. When it's kind of freestanding as it is in this design, you do want to ensure that it's not going to get pulled out of shape accidentally. However, I really love it with this heavy wire. If it eludes you, go for that hammering to give it a little bit of extra strength. For the next section of the video, we're going to make the bar that sits over the front of the spiral. You will need approximately 9 inches of 1mm or 18 gauge wire. I've got a little bit more than that here because I've pre-threaded my beads on, because we all know that I desperately suck at putting beads onto wire. So I've just pre-threaded mine and turned some ends over. Do make sure that your 6mm beads fit nicely onto your chosen 1mm or 18 gauge wire. So what I'm going to do is just trim away this end section and show you the technique. I'm working with an antique bronze colour copper core wire, but you can obviously mix your metals or keep them all the same, whatever makes you happy. I've gone for a variation of chakra colour beads, just because I think that they always look really nice on a drop pendant, but you can use however many and whatever colour and gemstone or non-gemstone material you prefer. I'm just going to scooch them up and out the way, making sure that I don't cause any damage. Little bit of extra warmth into the tail of wire we're going to start working with. And again, I'm going to add another spiral. Now on my demonstration piece, I've used a silver colour wire and I've gone for 3 rotations. In this piece, I think I'm going to go for 2 instead, just to show you the variation, with a slightly larger centre hole, into which you can add more charms later if you desire. So we've started off with that circular form with those round nose pliers, and now I'm going to push that into my non-dominant hand to create that 2-turn spiral. My brain stopped working for a second then. Once you've got your number of spiral turns that you want, you can give that a bit of a squish to strengthen up that metal. And then we're going to draw the wire away in a straight line. So obviously you don't have to put your beads on beforehand. It's just easier for you if I do. So make that a nice strong angle change. And then we do need to ensure that this section of wire is good and straight. So mine is again one of the ubiquitous pieces of scrap end of project wires that I found on my desk. And I'm just going to ensure that that's smooth and straight. Now what that also does is warms it up a little bit, which gives me an opportunity, because this is going to be covered with beads, if you need to manually straighten that wire, you absolutely can. Don't overly worry about the tool marks at this stage. So I'm making sure that that's nice and straight, and then I'm going to drop my chosen beads into position. There we go. So again, I'm going to try and match the orientation of my spiral so that it moves in the same direction. So this is going to be the front of my design, spiral moving in that clockwise fashion so that it will match my spiral that we're going to pop this over the front of. So once you've got your beads snuggled up nicely, you don't want to make sure that they're too tight. You want to give them a little bit of freedom, just a little bit of spacing. And then what we're going to do is to draw the wire away to one side. You can of course push those beads all the way down and use your pliers to define that little bit of extra space. Push the tail of that 1mm 18 gauge wire away, and now you know you've got a little bit of freedom to move them around. They don't need to be dead tight. Now in this next section of the tutorial, this is literally the fiddliest part of the whole thing. It's not a difficult project. This bit's the fiddliest bit. So let's just sit our bar drop over the top of our spiral. And ideally what I want to happen is for the central of those 7 beads to sit in the centre of your spiral. Now that can mean adjusting either the spiral so that that's a little bit larger or a little bit smaller, or it might mean just fiddling around with your beads. However it works for you. I'm just going to centralise the central bead. I think I need to make that spiral just a little bit larger. So I'm just going to do that by hand, making sure that the imaginary line through the top of that wrapped bail still passes through the very middle of that spiral design. So let's try that again. Now my central bead sits over the centre of the spiral, and what we're going to do is to pinch very firmly that whole assembly into position before I start rotating the tail of wire around the wire of the neck on that spiral section that we made. Now it is quite likely to move around a little bit to begin with, and what we're going to do is to utilise the gaps between those very heavy wire wraps to fit in our slightly lighter wire. So you will just need to take a little bit of time to make sure that you're happy with the overall shape and form. It becomes more tricky to modify the shape as you move through the design. So let's just hold that into position and then just start winding the wire around at whatever point on the coil you think is relevant. So I think it needs to go up one, and I'll start bringing that wire all the way around, sitting it in the groove created by that first wrap. So let's take a look. That looks pretty decent to me. Overall, I'm quite happy with how that sits. You might need to just make sure that your spiral down at the bottom doesn't rotate too far. Another thing to look out for is that you don't bend the wire up at the top of that stack too much. We do need there to be just a little bit of space in between those beads for later on. So give that a really good solid hold and take your wire all the way around, as far as you want to go, really. So if I take that any further, what's going to happen is the wire will fall off of the thick section and go down onto the single section. Now that's not a terrible thing to happen, but I don't think it will look as beautiful as it could if I keep it up on the top of the heaviest part of that neck. So what we're going to do now is to trim away to about 1.5 inches. Just need to pop this down. And you'll see that we've got loads of wire left over because I started with that elongated section, purely because I didn't want to have to thread my beads on camera. So let's make another spiral and sit that down over the top of that little bit of double wrapping we've just done. So again, with those round nose pliers, this time it's a lighter wire. I'm going a little bit closer to the end of those pliers, and now we're just going to push that into the non-dominant hand. If you need to give that a little bit of a squish, you absolutely can, just to make it a really nice closed up spiral to match the one down at the bottom. Now, if you wanted to, you could simply cut both ends to the same length and do your spiral afterwards so that they're exactly the same, but you don't really need to worry about it for this design. So let's give that a quick rotate until it sits up at the top of the design. And then all I'm going to do is push it down over that front section. So it's a little bit mobile for a moment, and then by the time you've pushed it down, things will start coming together. Like I said, you might need to just adjust the second spiral down at the bottom to make sure that it sits. That's definitely the fiddliest bit of the tutorial over and done with. It does pay to take your time to make sure you're happy with the overall shape of your spiral. Do make sure that you've got enough grooves on that central neck piece to wrap around with your lighter 1mm or 18 gauge wire onto which your beads are stacked. Let's head down to the board and undertake the next section of today's tutorial. In the next section of today's tutorial, we're going to be adding some detail. I've got some dinky little metal beads here. I think they're 2mm in fact. And I've also got a length of fine wire. This is 0.4mm or 26 gauge. And I'm going to be working with around about a 12-inch length because I have approximately that many beads. If you're going to be absolutely stacking those beads side by side all the way around the edge of your design, you may need a slightly longer piece of wire to work with. So we are going to begin just over on the closed side of the piece. I'm going to lay around about 3/4 inch of my finer gauge wire over the top, and I'm going to make sure that that wraps around solidly 3 times. Don't worry about that bar wiggling around at the moment. So I'm going to use my pliers to just help me get a grip of that sneaky little fine wire. Draw it all the way around and then make sure that you get 3 really good solid coiled wraps all the way around the wire. Once you've got them on to that heavier wire, we're going to scooch it all up together and make sure that it looks nice and tidy. If you've kind of messed it up a little bit, then do feel free to just cut that away and go again. It is important that the wire sits flat down over the surface of the heavier spiral. So I've just rotated my pliers around in the direction that the wire is moving, just to make sure that it's nice and smoothly set against that frame, against that spiral. What we're going to do now, and you may notice that the end of the wire is moving away towards the centre of the spiral. That's really quite important to note because we are now going to scooch that. Let's go to the back of the design, all the way around to the inside of the spiral. So we just add it on at this side because it's a little bit easier to do that. Then we're going to flip back to the front of the design, and what we need to do is to just secure our bead stick or drop section onto that frame. So almost hide that little spiral around as close as you can get it. Let's see which is going to be the easiest way to do this, is just to kind of bring that back up through so that the end of wire is sticking up towards the top of the design. Make sure that you're happy with the drop section where it sits on the spiral. Draw those little few wraps up as close as you can get to between bead number 3 and bead number 4. And then what we're going to do is to draw that around the stick that your beads are sitting on and push it back down into that spiral. Draw that wire all the way through for a minute, and then let's draw that up nice and tight. So make sure that your wrapping on is good and solid before you put any pressure on. I need to make sure that my central bead, so number 4 bead, sits in that centre of the spiral, and then I'm going to draw the wire down through the middle of the spiral and up and wrap it around 3 times on the continuation of that heavyweight spiral. So let's just push that wire through, and I'm going to wrap 3 times between each bead. Now if you want to add lots and lots of beads, you'll probably need more than 12 inches of wire, but I'm just going to be adding them and spacing them out a little bit, as I have done with this piece. So draw that wire through for a 3rd time. Make sure that that little spiral is nice and neat and tidy, and every time you add another bead, I've got some little silver colour ones here. Let's see if I can actually get one of these teeny tiny little things on the end of my wire. Not a fan of putting beads on wire on camera. Draw that to the outside of the spiral and just get that to sit on the outside. This is a technique I use lots and lots, never gets old. I love adding a halo of small beads to a heavy wire like this. So because my finer wire has come from underneath the spiral through the bead, I then need to take the tail end of that wire inside, comes over the top of the spiral section, inside that spiral, grip the bead into position, draw the wire all the way through, get a little bit of tension in on that first wrap, and then we're going to wrap 3 times and continue round to the 6 o'clock position. So keep adding beads, wrapping 3 times between each bead. You can really rack and stack them close to each other or spread them out a little bit more, as I am doing today in my demonstration piece. And then when you get to the middle bottom, I'll show you what to do next. So every time I've added a bead, I've gone on to wrap 3 times around the frame, making sure that those wraps are lovely and neat and tidy. You can just squish across those wraps if you need to. Be mindful of your beads if you're using gemstone or glass. I've wrapped 3 times around the frame, so what I'm going to do now is to attach that carefully to the frame of the spiral. So wherever you can find an access point, I could go over that little peachy moonstone, or I could go underneath next to the red jasper. I think I'll go next to the red jasper and just draw that through. Now the only thing really to be mindful of is that you continue wrapping your beads in the same fashion. The wire comes from underneath the spiral to go through the bead and over the top. So we need to replicate that on the far side, otherwise your bead wrapping halo doesn't look quite the same. So let's push that tail of wire all the way through and bring it up on the outside, so we can see that we will be following the same pattern of adding that halo of beads. Do make sure that you add a fair amount of tension at this stage without deforming your bead stick or without pulling too hard and dislodging any of your wrapping, or worst case scenario, snapping that wire. Little bit of tension, pull that nice and strongly, and then I'm just going to push that leading edge through to make sure that that sits neat and tidy, and then I'll wrap a further 2 times. 1 and 2. When you're wrapping with 0.4 gauge wire, as we are now, you can quite often just neaten that spiral up just using your fingernails. If you don't have any, or you don't want to use them in this fashion, you can use the tips of your chain nose plier just to make that neat and tidy. What we will continue to do then is add beads in exactly the same fashion. Here we go. This is why I don't do it on camera, because I can't see the hole. There we are. pull that all the way down so that it sits on the outside of that spiral frame. Now what I like to do is to keep the spacing between those beads as similar as possible all the way through. So I've gone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on that side. So I'll try to use 6 beads by the time I get to just about here. And then however many I've got left, or however many fit in the gap above that point. Just try to keep them evenly spaced so that it looks beautiful when it's done. When you get up to that last little section and you want to fit one more bead in, you might need to just scooch those beads a little bit too close together, fit your last bead onto the outside of that spiral, and finish off with a good solid wrap. Now because it's going to be kind of hidden by my number 1 bead on the stick, I might go for a couple of extra wraps, and instead of just going for 3, I might just try and fill as much of that gap as I can. 4 and a 5th wrap. That will keep it nice and solid and secure. Let's just flip that over. What I'm going to do here is to trim that wire away just near the front. Let's get that tail in the bin. And then what we need to do is tuck the sticky uppy bit. I don't know if you can see it. There's a tiny bit of wire sticking up. We're just going to smooth that around so that it sits near the front of the design, where it won't get caught on your skin. And then what we can do is scooch those last beads over so that they are more evenly spaced with the rest of the design. Now if you chose to make this without the jointed bail up at the top, your bail wire here would be in the 90-degree opposing position, which means that you are all done. However, if you wanted to add a little bit more detail, I'll show you how to do that now. It's kind of cute like that. It reminds me a little bit of a treble clef. I do have a tutorial for musical note charms and a treble clef inspired ring on my channel. Give it a search if that interests you. So if you did make your loop at 90 degrees, then that's ready to wear. However, I like to have a little bit more movement in jewellery. It catches the eye. So I'll show you now how to make that extra bail section to give it a little bit more wiggle. So if you remember earlier on, we started with a 12-inch length of that very heavy wire and we put aside this offcut. Now we're going to use this to make an extended bail to add a little bit more movement, a little bit more fun if you like that kind of thing. I've got a beautiful large hole ceramic bead that I'm going to be using, but what we're going to do now is to grab those bail making pliers and we're going to start around about 2/3 of the way from the end, and this is probably around about a 4-inch length. So let's just put a right angle bend in there. Now I'm doing a cheaty thing with my box joint. I'm just going to create a right angle bend using that box joint. It can save time if you're in a rush. So the bail up at the top, I tend to have quite an oversized bail because it means you can use any threading material, but you may wish to have or may need to have a slightly smaller bail if your piece of wire isn't terribly long, or you can always cut yourself a new bit. So let's go for number 4 on the bail making pliers to begin with. Rotate that all the way around until you get that rounded form. A little bit more of a thing to be doing with such heavy wire. And because this is a relatively short piece, I've made a smaller loop and I'm going to push that onto my spiral drop pendant. So let's just open that loop up. I quite like to have the bent side of that loop at the front rather than the cut side. So what I'm going to do is to just hold that upside down, slide it into the loop we've created, and then I know that I'll be able to see, for my eyes, the nicer side of that loop. Now when you're wrapping with a very heavy wire like this, it is incredibly common for the tail of wire, as you draw it around the core, to start kind of eating away at the wire in the loop here. Do you know what? On a design like this, it doesn't matter if this loop gets a little bit smaller, but you can help that by holding very firmly across that loop at the point where the angle change takes place underneath and pushing that around. Now we're only going to get a single wrap and a half, and it is quite something to achieve on your fingers. So again, if you're struggling with this weight of wire, try it with a 1.25mm approximately 16 gauge, or for instance, you could go for a simple loop, an open and closable loop, if you're really struggling. Because the wire's heavy, if you do go for an open and closable simple loop like this one, for 9 times out of 10 you're going to be absolutely fine. You shouldn't have any dramas with this coming open. If you feel like that will be a risk for you, then do give it a quick hammer. However, I'm just going to try and close up this little wrap to show you that it can be done. So I'm going to grip across that loop that we've just made, make it nice and straight, and then start pushing that tail of wire around the core. So I'm gripping across the loop, bring that all the way around. So just little by little, I'm doing literally less than 1/4 of a turn at a time. Now, ideally, I want to have the cut end finishing at the back. So let's see if we can get that to go all the way around to the rear side so that it's away from immediate view. I have a feeling it's just going to make it. And then I'm just going to rotate those pliers around that very heavy coil to smooth that end down. And it's quite rare to be able to see the effect of this, because usually the wire is a lot smaller and you can't really see. But what you'll see is that the end is just getting slightly polished as the pliers rotate over that cut section. So just give that a little bit of more of a push. Let's take a look at what we've got so far. So if you didn't like how that ended, I think actually that's going to be fine. But if you didn't like it, you could very much allow some of the wire to creep up from the loop that we created. And I'll show you that now. By pulling very firmly, we'll shrink that loop down a little bit, and we'll get just a little bit more wire over the back of that design. Do be careful not to crimp your fingers with the end of your pliers. It's quite sore when that happens. So let's just support and make sure that we're happy. So if we come back to the front side, just that little extra millimetre or so really can help. But again, do take your time. I'm not going to sit here and do it for hours because you will get very bored. Then we are going to add on our chosen large hole bead. I've gone for this beautiful two-tone ceramic. I think it's gorgeous. And then what we will do is grip across the wire and make that bail shape. So we've got more wire on this end. We could in theory go for a slightly larger loop for our bail wire. I don't really think it needs to be huge, to be completely honest, because I think most of my chains will go through it. Let's go for a number 4 again. Be mindful of your bead at this stage. Draw that wire all the way around. And we've got plenty of tail there to repeat exactly as we did on the first side. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed today's tutorial. I think they're really kind of cute. As ever, endless possibilities. I hope that you enjoy your day, no matter what it is you're doing. And I look forward to seeing you back here on the Gemhawks YouTube channel very soon. Bye for now.